It's good to be with you. Good to be with you guys again this evening and in present, those of you who are in person and those that I see by Zoom. So let's open in prayer. Heavenly Father, as we gather here this evening, some of us in person, some of us virtually by Zoom, we're thankful, Lord, for who you are and what you've done through your Son, Jesus Christ. We're thankful for making yourself known to us, Lord, through nature, through your word, and through your Son, Lord. And we are thankful, particularly this evening, for this ministry, which has meant so much to us through the years and this year specifically. Lord, I just pray you would be with all of us this evening so we can take away some nugget of truth that will stay with us and influence our lives. And I just pray for Jeffrey as he delivers tonight's lesson. Speak through him. Give us words that we need to hear. And I pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
Well, thank you, Paul and Millie, and good to see you all. Nice to have you with us, and those of you joining us via Zoom as well. This has certainly been a different kind of course than what we typically offer through the Areopagus. It'll be more of our regular fare in the fall, as we will focus on the life and works of Francis Schaeffer, and we'll be focused on what we call cultural Christian apologetics. In other words, how does Christian apologetics and Christian faith in general relate to the broader, greater issues of life? And so our present course has been focused on our own individual spiritual lives, which is absolutely essential. But we also understand that holistic discipleship takes in every area of life. So I think you'll find it to be an extremely valuable and certainly relevant course coming up in the fall. And as Millie mentioned, we'll also be doing some Areopagus forums over the summer and special topics, and hope you'll be able to join us for all or most of those as well. Now, Millie also mentioned our Areopagus forum that we have scheduled for tomorrow evening via Zoom exclusively. And this is called The Problem of Apatheism. Those who are apathetic, obviously, how to share the gospel effectively with those who seem not to care. Okay. And this really opens up a different avenue of evangelism and witnessing and apologetics. And how can we make an impact on people like that who are so distracted by worldly concerns that the gospel and a relationship with God seemingly is very, very low priority, if no priority at all. So as I mentioned in the blurb that we sent out, we all have family members and probably friends whom we long to see come to faith in Jesus Christ, but who seem totally disinterested. They've got other things going on that are priorities in their life, they think. So in this particular book called Apatheism, How We Share When They Don't Care, Kyle Beshears offers wise insights and counsel on how to engage and motivate such people to awaken from their spiritual malaise. So I think you'll find his presentation tomorrow evening to be extremely valuable. As I said, I think we all have family members or friends who we would love to bring the faith to Christ, but again, just total disinterest or apparent disinterest on their part. So what is a good approach to sharing the gospel with people like that? Now, we have much to cover this evening. I know that comes as a surprise. It's been a very content-filled course, and I believe this is about our 14th or 15th week. So we've covered a lot of ground in this course. We've talked about, for instance, what is Christian religion and how does that how does that relate to Christian spirituality? And as we oftentimes say, the Christian faith is fundamentally and essentially a spiritual relationship with God through faith in Jesus Christ. But Christianity is also religion. We have our traditions and our rituals and our literature, institutions, and so on. So Christianity is a religion, but only secondarily is it a religion. It's primarily a spiritual connection with God through faith in Jesus Christ and the internal presence of the Holy Spirit. So we talked about that. We looked briefly at an article by Lillian Daniel called Spiritual But Not Religious. Stop Boring Me. And that's commentary on people in our society who claim that they are very, quote, spiritual, but they have no interest in, quote, religion. And so hopefully you remember the main points that she's making in that short article. It's, I think, very pertinent to our situation. Then we talked about Christian and Eastern spirituality. In other words, Christianity compared to various forms of Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, and so on. What are the fundamental differences in Christian and Eastern spirituality? We drew a sharp distinction there. We looked at an article called The Kingdom of Noise, a Screwtape Letter, and how that's one of the greatest challenges we face in contemporary society and culture, and that is we live in an extraordinarily noisy society. And it's not conducive to the kind of in-depth spiritual concentration that we've been emphasizing in this particular course. Now, I think most, if not all of you, also picked up a copy of the Rose publication pamphlet, Spiritual Disciplines, Exploring the Classic Disciplines of the Christian Faith. And so we didn't have time actually in class to go through this methodically, but I hope you have a copy of this and refer back to it, at least every few months or so, because there's an awful lot of very important, very quality material in that pamphlet. Now, we also looked at an article by William Lane Craig called The Dual Nature of Jesus. Our first book that we did a study of was Dallas Willard's book, The Spirit of the Disciplines, Understanding How God Changes Lives. Then we proceeded to look at Richard Foster's modern classic, Celebration of Discipline, The Path to Spiritual Growth. I think we spent about 3 sessions on that book alone. I had passed out a flyer that I assume all of you were able to download or received in class, Confession of Sins, something that I keep by my Bible when I'm doing my daily devotionals on a regular basis. Then after that, we looked at another great modern classic, Henry Nouwen's book, The Way of the Heart. From there, we went back in time about 300 or 400 years to Brother Lawrence's book, The Practice of the Presence of God. That's always one of those that comes up in the contemplative Christian tradition as one of the great classics. And now we are in session 2 of Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. And I appreciated so much what David Tilley did last week in terms of introducing us to this book. And it's really a book that probably would have demanded 3 or maybe even 4 sessions, but we'll go as far as we can this evening, trying to touch on at least most of the major points in Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. So we have covered an enormous amount in this course. And I hope you found it to be not only informative and interesting, but really spark maybe a renewed interest on your part to make communing with God on a regular basis a top priority. And for reasons that I've never been able to imagine, so much of what we've talked about in the last 3 months is not commonly talked about in evangelical churches or Protestant churches in general. In fact, actually, it rarely ever comes up in a lot of Roman Catholic or Orthodox churches. But it's a great spiritual tradition that we have, and yet it's so tragically overlooked in our time. So I hope it's opened up, a new pathway to a deeper spiritual life and a deeper communion with God in your own personal life. Well, let's go back to a few points that David Tilley made last week in his excellent introduction to Man's Search for Meaning. And if you're following along in the study guide there, starting with the introduction, who was this man, this author, Viktor Frankl? Well, Viktor Frankl, you see his lifetime spanned pretty much the entire 20th century. He's an Austrian neurologist. He's a psychiatrist, a philosopher, an author. He's also, of course, remember, a Holocaust survivor. He spent 3 years in Nazi concentration camps, including Dachau and Auschwitz. Now, let's see, I've been to Poland, I believe, 4 times, and that's always a priority, going to Auschwitz. I mean, talk about encountering the realities of human nature, the stark, naked, ugly realities of human nature. Auschwitz, there's no more appropriate place to visit. Now, in 1948, Viktor Frankl earned, so this will be 3 years after the Second World War, he earned a PhD in philosophy from the University of Vienna. His dissertation was entitled The Unconscious God, and what it did was examine the relationship between psychology and religion. Now, his primary contribution to psychology and psychotherapy was his development of what he called logotherapy. Now, logos is a familiar term to us Christians, but logotherapy was actually a psychological theory based on the premise that mankind's primary motivational force in life is, quote, the will to meaning in life. In other words, in contrast to somebody like Sigmund Freud, the great guru of psychology and psychoanalysis, unfortunately, Freud, you remember, emphasized the pleasure principle, sex and other forms of pleasure. And he basically would try to make the argument that that is the driving force in our lives. And, since according to him, that's a natural part of our being, then apparently that should be a primary driving force. But he also cautioned about, taking it to excess. It can have certainly a negative effect on our lives. But that's Sigmund Freud, the pleasure principle. Now, the other, quote, great, end quote, psychoanalyst of the 20th century was Alfred Adler, also a Viennese. And Alfred Adler, you remember, emphasized the power principle. He insisted that man's most basic instinct is a search, is an attempt to establish power and influence and status and control over others. That's how we get through life and feel like we've lived a meaningful life, according to Alfred Adler. Well, in contrast, though, to Freud and Adler, Frankl will insist that man's most basic instinct is a search for meaning and purpose in life. Now, why would he say that that's our basic instinct or basic challenge in life if he didn't believe that we had something like a soul that transcends just materiality and just transcends nature? And in fact, as you probably picked up last week, Viktor Frankl did believe in God. Now, he was very careful not to get real specific about that, who and what is God. But he implies in his writings that God, the ultimate power and force in the universe, is not just an immaterial force, but rather apparently has personality. Okay. And so whether Viktor Frankl was a deist who just believed that there was some kind of God who created the universe, created natural physical laws, and allowed those to govern the flow of the universe without any kind of direct involvement. So that's deism. Whether he was a deist or whether he was some kind of very, very soft theist is unclear in his writings. Now, of course, he came out of a Jewish tradition, and so his understanding of reality was conditioned somewhat by Judaism and by Old Testament principles and so on. But in contrast to the pleasure principle and the power principle, no, Frankl says, no, we exist for a higher purpose than just pleasure and power. We exist. There is an innate meaning to our life, a purpose and a meaning. Okay. Now, unlike most social and psychological theorists, Frankl understood that fulfillment in life comes by way of not self-aggrandizement and self-fulfillment, but rather it comes through dedication to a cause outside of ourselves, a cause greater than ourselves. And this is how he put it in Man's Search for Meaning. Quote, I admonish my students, do not aim for success in this life. The more you aim at it and make it your target, the more you're going to miss it, because there's always more and more and more and more and more for those who lust after success in life as they define it. He goes on to say, for success, like happiness, cannot really be pursued. Instead, it must ensue, and it only does so as the unintended side effect of one's personal dedication to a cause greater than oneself, or as the byproduct of one's surrender to a person other than oneself. So he's talking about we're created for a purpose, and that is to we serve a cause greater than ourselves. We also, and again, he's unfortunately a little ambivalent about all this, but we also are here to surrender to a person other than ourselves as well. And he says that in order to be happy, which is what so many people long for in their life, we must have a reason to be happy. Okay, so happiness is not something we pursue, it's something that ensues as a result of pursuing something above and beyond our own ego gratification and beyond just our own sense of self-fulfillment. Now, by calling his readers to a cause greater than oneself, what Frankl is implying there is that that cause itself should be true, should be good, should be beautiful. Remember the Platonic triad, the good, the true, the good, and the beautiful. It also should be honorable, and it also should be righteous. Now, if you look there in your outline under spiritual orientation, a religious existentialist, Frankl was an existentialist. He believes that we have to discover our meaning and purpose in life through our own through our own intuitive senses and our own unique life experiences. In that regard, he says there is nothing in the book that implies that mankind has an inherent sin problem that has to be spiritually regenerated. So this is where there's a stark contrast in his understanding of religion and human nature, stark contrast in that, and the Christian understanding, and frankly, a stark contrast in his understanding of the nature of mankind and traditional Judaism too, which also emphasizes the innate sinfulness, the fallen nature of mankind. But unlike most modern existentialists who tend to be agnostic or even atheist, Frankl was neither an agnostic nor a secular humanist. He believed in some kind of a, quote, God, presumably a personal God rather than some vague, immaterial and impersonal cosmic force. In other words, the question really is, was Viktor Frankl a deist or was he a theist? And unfortunately, he's so vague on these issues, it's hard to know. But what we can say about his book, and I think what makes it so extremely valuable for us to read today, Christians to read today, is Viktor Frankl, in so many ways, introduces us to essential core issues of the human life that bring us right up to the point of spiritual conversion and the acknowledgement of our sin nature. He takes us up to that point. He doesn't go beyond that point. We need Jesus and we need the gospel to go beyond that. Nonetheless, his books are very, very valuable. Now, psychoanalysis and logotherapy, again, if you're following along in your study guide notes, traditional psychoanalysis is all about introspection. And it's also, you might say, retrospective as well. Traditional psychoanalysis is more focused on, quote, finding oneself. In other words, what am I? And that's about the extent of it. It doesn't go beyond that to what can I be? Now, Sigmund Freud, again, developed his philosophy of psychoanalysis based on a naturalistic, a godless worldview. And Frankl, again, is departing from that, at least in a strict sense. He departs from that totally atheistic, secularistic point of view. And in Freud's system, human behavior is totally deterministic. In other words, what we think and how we live is a product of deterministic, instinctual desires. I think, well, wait a minute. If that's all we are, if our self-awareness and how we behave and think and so on is merely the product of predetermined desires or instincts, I guess is a better word, well, what makes us different from animals? And Freud, of course, would have no explanation for that. In fact, he would buy into the Darwinian naturalistic theory that, well, in fact, that's all we are as animals. We're just flukes of the universe who have evolved far beyond all the rest of the animal kingdom. But we don't have a soul, so we are purely material beings. And now, if this is true, and that is that we're born and we live with only basic instincts like animals, then the whole idea of free will is an illusion. Viktor Frankl puts it this way, quote, "What is missing in Freudian psychology is the human reality which I've come to term self-transcendence. Animals don't have that capacity for self-transcendence. The intrinsic fact that being human always relates and points to something other than itself. Better to say something or someone beyond ourselves. That is to say, rather than being concerned with any inner condition, be it pleasure or be it homeostasis, man is oriented toward the world out there, and within his world, he is interested in meanings to fulfill and in other human beings as well. By virtue of what I would call the pre-reflected ontological self-understanding, mankind knows that he is actualizing himself precisely to the extent to which he is forgetting himself. And he is forgetting himself by giving himself, be it through serving a cause higher than himself or love of a person for a person other than himself. Truly, he says, self-transcendence is the essence of human existence. So this, in his mind, is what one factor that distinguishes us from the animal world. Now, in contrast again to Freudian and Adlerian psychotherapy, logotherapy is, as I said, meaning-centered, or you might say purpose-driven, purpose-centered, okay? In his psychotherapy practice through the years, Viktor Frankl would sometimes ask his patients who came to him depressed and oftentimes very dysfunctional in life, he would ask his patients, well, why don't you just commit suicide? It's an honest question, see? And it's one that actually every individual who's ever lived has to seriously consider. If this world is absurd, if there's no meaning and purpose to it, if we don't even have any free will to where we can be within the limits of human nature, where we can be self-determining, what on earth is the point in living at all? Why don't you commit suicide? If you're that cynical about life, your life or life in general. And he goes on to say that only human beings who are unique among all species, only human beings have any sense at all that they should have meaning and purpose in life. Now, as Christians, we understand that having been created in the imago Dei, having been created in the image of God, only human beings have a soul. God's created us not only with a rational mind, if we'll use it, not only has he created us with a creative and imaginative potential, if we'll use it, but also God has created us with an innate moral conscience to distinguish between what's right and what's wrong and good and evil. So again, this is going to be one of those factors that really makes him stand out in his field, in contrast to the two great gurus that he followed, Freud and Adler. Now, according to Viktor Frankl, both Freudian and Adlerian psychology discount what he calls the higher aspirations of the human psyche, beyond merely seeking pleasure or merely seeking power. And he puts it this way: logotherapy deviates from psychoanalysis insofar as it considers man to be a being whose main concern consists in fulfilling meaning in life, rather than in the mere gratification and satisfaction of his instincts and desires, or in merely reconciling the conflicting claims of the id, the ego, and the superego, or in the mere adaptation and adjustment to society and the environment. So basically what Frankl's arguing here is we're unique of all in terms of all species. We have an innate sense of purpose and meaning, of right and wrong, and our society and our genetics don't totally determine who and what we are. So even if you are born and raised in the most despicable environment imaginable, such as Nazi Germany, we could name many others, we still have a free will to where we can make our lives count for something above and beyond just our own ego gratification. So in contrast to psychoanalysis, logotherapy, as he developed this field, recognizes that tension is an indispensable prerequisite for mental health, because tension drives us beyond just superficialities. When you have tension and pressure in your life, you got to get serious about why am I here, and what's the purpose of my life, and so on. So he says basically that tension is indispensable. It's an indispensable prerequisite for mental health, also, spiritual health, obviously. The tension between what one has achieved and what one should strive to accomplish, or between basically what one currently is and what one can be. So what's the main symptoms of a self-centered orientation? He tells us self-centeredness, or we oftentimes call this egocentrism, is manifest in boredom. When you're just totally self-obsessed, it's a recipe for boredom, because frankly, you're not that interesting if that's your entire world, So it's manifest in boredom. It's manifest in anxiety. In other words, I wish I were better than I am. It's manifest in depression, in aggression, oftentimes, striking out at those who we think are keeping us from being self-fulfilled. And also, it's a contributing factor to addiction. This comes with an obsession for power, money, status, pleasure, self-recognition, and so on. And Frankl puts it this way, quote, "Today, man's will to meaning is frustrated on a worldwide scale. Ever more people are haunted by a feeling of meaninglessness, by feelings of emptiness. An existential vacuum opens up. It mainly manifests itself in boredom and apathy. While boredom is indicative of a loss of interest in the world, apathy, again, we'll be talking tomorrow night in our Areopagus Forum about apathy, the problem of apathy. He says, while boredom is indicative of a loss of interest in the world, apathy betrays a lack of the initiative to do anything worthwhile in the world, to change something in the world for the better." He says, and this is an interesting commentary. Now, keep in mind, he's writing this 50 years ago, and again, after having gone through World War II and so on. He says, "Our industrialized society is apt to satisfy all human needs." Now, I'd say that's not properly stated. I'd say our industrial society is out to satisfy all human desires, okay? And its companion, the consumer society, is even out to create ever new needs or desires to satisfy. But the most human of all needs, the need to find and fulfill meaning in our lives, is frustrated by the society in which we live. In the wake of industrialization, urbanization tends to uproot man from his traditions, alienate him from the values which are transmitted by our traditions, which constantly erode over time. Understandably, it is in particular the young generation who is most affected by the resulting feelings of meaninglessness. More specifically, such phenomena as addiction, aggression, and depression are, in the final analysis, due to this sense of futility. Now, again, kind of an aside note, while challenging people to transcend their egoism, their egocentrism, through self-transcendence, as he puts it, and to, while challenging people to pursue worthwhile goals in life, Frankl fails to acknowledge that egocentrism, which is frankly just another name for sin, another word for sin. Sin is inherent to human nature and can only be overcome through genuine spiritual conversion. In other words, a heartfelt repentance and submission to divine guidance through a deep love relationship with God through faith in Jesus Christ. Or as Jesus declared, you must be born again. You must be spiritually regenerated. So again, that's the critical factor that Frankl is not, acknowledging. So like I said, his book is so very, very valuable in terms of exposing a lot of the fraud and fallacies in modern, contemporary Western society and culture. And he oftentimes takes us up to the point of true conversion, but he leaves it at that point. Okay. All right, now in your notes, if you'll see, look there at the section on concentration camp psychology. Again, the question is, why don't you just commit suicide? Your life is abject misery in these concentration camps. You're seeing people being brutalized and in every possible way constantly. Why should you go on living? And as I said, Frankl survived 3 years in concentration camps. By the way, his father, his mother, his brother, and his wife were all either worked to death or else they were killed in the gas chambers and their bodies cremated in the ovens. Okay. About 90% of new arrivals to Auschwitz, for instance, 90%, as soon as they stepped off the trains, were sent immediately to the gas chambers. Okay. and only the select 10% were kept alive for a little while so they could be essentially worked to death. Now, he was one of those who was selected to work in the camp. Frankl describes in detail the inhumane conditions in the camps that were designed to dehumanize the inmates, to humiliate them, to degrade the prisoners as if they were absolutely soulless animals. And he writes, life in a concentration camp tore open the human soul and exposed its depths. So Dave mentioned last week that Frankl talks about 4 stages of psychological reaction to being dumped into one of these concentration camps. And first of all, it was initial shock, this sense of abject hopelessness, just filthy, dirty, obscene places. Second was apathy and insensitivity. Frankl writes that apathy, the main symptom of the second phase, was a necessary mechanism of self-defense. If you really cared so deeply about what was happening to all these people around you, you wouldn't be able to handle it emotionally. He says this was a kind of emotional death, disgust with all the filth, all the stench, all the ugliness in the camp, and an insensitivity to the daily and hourly beatings. He goes on to say, that's detail I'll skip over. Thirdly, he says, would be a sense of bitterness, hostility, and violence. You see all this inhumanity going on, and you would love to strike back and kill, if not torture to death, these thugs, these Nazi thugs. And by the way, he says this probably typified most of those who were survivors, but there were others, such as himself, who survived by other, what he calls more spiritual means by which they survived. Now, in terms of this third phase of bitterness, hostility, and violence, Frankl writes, it is very...
By the way, just
Pardon-
so they know,
pardon me?
page 3. Page 3.
Oh, okay, thank you. Yeah, so we're on page 3 of the notes. Frankl says it's very difficult for an outsider to grasp just how very little value was placed on human life. He says everything that was not connected with the immediate task of keeping oneself and one's closest friends alive, everything else was lost. It lost its value. A man's character became involved to the point that he was caught in a mental turmoil, which threatened all his values that he held and threw them all in doubt. And human dignity robbed man of his will and made him an object to be exterminated. Talks about the total loss of a sense of inherent human value. He says, on the average, only those prisoners could keep alive who had lost all scruples in their fight for existence. On the average. Now, there were exceptions, but on the average, only those prisoners could keep alive who lost all scruples. They were prepared to use every means, honest and otherwise, even brute force, theft, and betrayal of their friends in order to save themselves. And he goes on to say, no man should judge, by the way, no man should judge what was going on among the inmates unless he himself asks himself in absolute honesty whether in a similar situation he might not have done the same. And that is just become an animal. And, all that matters is your survival. Okay. Just like all the other animals, inmates and guards and the people running the prison camp, they're all, almost all, acting like animals. Fourthly, hopelessness in the midst of all this pain and all this uncertainty. I mean, they had no idea when the war was going to end. For all they knew, they would almost assuredly die in this concentration camp. I mean, this war could go on another 10 or 15 years for all they knew. Now, he tells it makes a couple of interesting points in this section. He says that some in the camp who were religious simply gave up because they believed, they sincerely, truly believed that a better life awaits them in the afterlife. Interesting. This was true for Christians, undoubtedly, and Jews and others, I guess, as well. He makes the comment, those of us who survived, we know that the best of us did not return. According to him, the best, were either brutalized to death, or some of them just lost the will to live. After all, a better world awaits us, a better life awaits us. Why endure this horrifying violence? For the few who still struggle to live, though, the question has to be, why? Why would you want to continue to live? Why continue to live in the midst of such degrading, such hopeless conditions? And Frankl says, woe to him who saw no more sense in this life, in his life, no aim, no purpose, and therefore no point in carrying on. And this is where he introduces us for the second time in the book to that famous quote by Nietzsche, who wrote, he who has a why to live can bear with almost any how. He who has a why to live can bear with almost any how. So if you really believe your life has meaning and purpose, then you can bear up under the most excruciating conditions imaginable. Now, the next subtopic, I think, in your notes, how did Frankl survive? Well, he was one of the very few who did. Ironically, his life was spared because he volunteered for medical service in another camp that was infested with typhoid fever. Rather risky, to say the least. And near the end of his ordeal, he was asked to address the men in the infirmary, both the attending doctors, if you want to call them doctors, and the patients themselves. And he reminded them that anyone still alive has reason for hope. Anyone who's still living has reason for hope. And although he had two opportunities to escape in the final days before the end of the war, he felt that he should remain and attend to his patients in the infirmary. Now, what kind of character does that take for somebody who has the opportunity to escape from this hellhole, and he passes it up because he believed that God had put him in this situation to help others? Now, Dave mentioned this last week, and it bears reiteration. Before the war ever began, Frankl had a visa permit to immigrate to the United States. He was offered a position to lecture at a university and to study, but he decided not to leave Austria. And by then it was part of the German Empire, of course, Hitler's empire. He chose not to leave and come to the United States because in doing so, he would have to leave his mother and father behind and his wife and all. Now, he told the story of his father, a very devout Jew, having a small stone that he kept in his house. It was a stone from a destroyed synagogue. And it had on it the symbol of one of the 10 commandments. And Frankl asked his father on one occasion, what does that mean? And his father said, well, that's a small portion of one of the 10 commandments. Well, which commandment is it? And his father said, honor thy father and thy mother, that your days may be long on this earth. And so that's in his mind all this time as World War II is approaching. He has an opportunity to escape to the United States, to freedom. but he passes it up because honor your father and your mother. He thought that would be disrespectful if he left them behind with the prospects of war, right on the horizon. It's incredible. Sounds like something Dietrich Bonhoeffer would have done, and he did. Yeah.
It also sounds like things that people in Ukraine are having to choose to do right now too.
Yes,
Sure.
absolutely. And I know that's oftentimes off the front pages now. It's not the lead story on the nightly news, but their situation every bit as desperate. They're every bit as deserving of our help and support as they were the first few weeks of this unconscionable invasion. Thanks. Good point. All right, so Frankel has, as I said, a couple of opportunities to escape in the final days, but he feels like he needs to remain behind because he's got these patients in this infirmary that are dependent upon him. Now, on the last day before the concentration camp was liberated, the SS, those that superintended these concentration camps, the SS arranged for the prisoners to be taken to another facility where they said the Red Cross was waiting to take custody of them. Wow. Well, this is what Frankel writes about that. Now, my friend and I stood in the last group of people to be taken to that facility where the Red Cross was helping people. My friend and I stood in the last group from which 13 of us would be chosen for the next to last truck. The chief doctor counted out the requisite number, but he omitted us, the two of us. The 13 were loaded into the truck, and we were forced to stay behind. Now, we were very surprised, we were annoyed, we were disappointed, to say the least, and we blamed the chief doctor, who excused himself by saying that, I'm sorry, I was really tired and distracted. Otherwise, I would have included you among the ones who left the camp. He said that he had thought that we still intended to escape on our own accord. Now, Frankel and his associates spent that night in the abandoned guard room when they were suddenly awakened by gunfire. Quote, then we grasped what was happening. The battlefront had actually finally reached us. The shooting decreased and morning dawned. Outside on the flagpole at the camp gate, a white flag floated in the wind. So the Nazi guards had all fled as the Allies, this would have been the Russians actually, approached the camp. And here's something to ponder. Many weeks later, Frankel found out what had happened in those final hours. Our friends who had thought they were traveling to freedom, to that camp where the Red Cross was waiting to attend to them, our friends who had thought they were traveling to freedom that night had been taken in the trucks to another camp. And there they were locked in huts and burned to death. So, any thoughts before we move on? Well, this story has always reminded me of a poem and a song. And the poem actually kind of emerged in the 1970s, more or less, in different variations. Nobody knows who actually wrote this. It's called Footprints in the Sand. And you're probably familiar with it. And here's one of several versions of it. A pilgrim arrived in heaven and God said to him, would you like to see where you've come from? When the pilgrim responded that yes, he would, God unfolded the story of his whole life, and the pilgrim saw footprints from the cradle to the grave. Only there were not only the footprints of the pilgrim, but there was another set of prints alongside him. The pilgrim said, I see my footprints, but whose are those? And the Lord said, well, those are my footprints. I was with you all the time. Then they came to a very dark, discouraging valley, and the pilgrim said, well, I only see one set of footprints going through this valley. I was so discouraged. You were not there with me. It was just as I thought. I was so very much alone. And you know the rest of it. Then the Lord said, oh, but I was there. I was there with you the entire time. You see, those are my footprints. I was carrying you through the valley. I imagine Viktor Frankl would have found that very, very meaningful. And as I said, it does remind me of a song I wanted to play. And if you have your songs for reflection, this would be number 6, Every Grain of Sand. Now, just let me say before I play this, that not only does this song remind me of that truth in that poem, Footprints in the Sand, but I do believe that when God created mankind and imbued us with vocality and the ability to sing, this is what he had in mind, that we might all sing just like this. By the way, I'm being facetious. This is Bob Dylan. Now, I know that we're all extremely jealous that we can't sing that well. But in terms of what really matters here, I mean, look at the last verse there. I hear the ancient footsteps in the motion of the sea. Sometimes I turn, there's someone there. Other times it's only me, or at least it appears to be only me. I'm hanging in the balance of the reality of man, like every sparrow falling and every grain of sand. Our lives, just every moment of our lives, we are hanging in the balance. And it's only by divine grace that we live another second day. Yeah, very thoughtful song. Yes, Paul.
I found online, the last 2 lines, I'm hanging in the balance of, it says, a perfect finished plan.
Of a perfect finished plan.
That's what came up on this. Yeah.
This is a song that was that Bob Dylan wrote in 1982. That was during a period in which he had publicly professed that he had had a Christian conversion. He made 3 albums, very interesting albums that were all explicitly Christian albums. I write about this in a short biography of Bob Dylan that I wrote years ago. We're not real sure exactly why he didn't continue to write explicitly about his Christian faith. I speculate in that biography why that might have been the case, but that's very interesting, Paul. So would you repeat that again?
Sure.
I'm hanging in the balance.
Singing what I was reading.
Yeah, I'm hanging in the balance of the
Hanging in the
reality
balance of a perfect finished plan.
of a perfect finished
Like
plan.
every sparrow falling, like every grain of sand.
Interesting, interesting.
Yeah,
Well,
I'm reading the same version online too.
Okay, well, and of course, Dylan would from time to time alter the lyrics, over the years. So I'm glad you mentioned that, yeah. So have to integrate that into this. Any other thoughts on what we've covered so far before we move on?
Just one thought. I just have to thank you for bringing up the Footsteps poem. Because I didn't become a Christian till I was 30. And in my 20s, as I was seeking, my grandfather he hand wrote that poem to me and sent it to me. It was his way of witnessing God to me. And just because you read that tonight, it allowed a beautiful memory to come back to me that I had forgotten about all these years. Thank you.
Absolutely, amen. The times in this life when we feel most vulnerable and alone can very well be the times in which God is managing our lives even more than is normally the case to get us through those times.
Jeffrey,
Yes, Millie?
recently on Breakpoint, they had an emphasis like in the last week on teen sadness. And I couldn't help but think about that. So many, it seems, of this younger generation, they're just in despair for whatever reason. I mean, comparing it to what Frankel was dealing with, it doesn't seem even a comparison, but just the social media is sort of at the forefront, or just looking at the world and everything that's happening. I mean, I can see if you don't have a strong faith of that there is ultimately someone in charge and this is not all there is. I can see how these young people are really struggling. But
Yes.
teen sadness has been sort of the thing that they've been addressing.
Okay,
Depression and suicide.
Yes.
depression and suicide, drugs,
Mhm.
all these illegal drugs, fentanyl pouring over the southern border with no control hardly at all due to this administration. This generation of young people is just really subjected to things that many of us could hardly imagine. Mhm.
Well, it's really tragic when you think about how many opportunities that they have before them and that they can't see that
Mhm.
for everything else going on
Mhm.
around them.
Yes,
Or maybe just that inner focus, so much on self, as was mentioned, and not on a meaning and a purpose for something higher and bigger.
yes, absolutely. Well, let's move on beyond where we are here. We have about 20 minutes to go, and I'd like to cover as much of this very, very valuable, important book as possible. It's either that or subject you to another Bob Dylan song. So we'll opt for further review of
His
the.
voice is much clearer today. Listen during the bad.
Oh, yes, really?
I think so.
All right, so if you see there in your notes, major themes, the key to life. And as mentioned earlier, in his psychotherapy practice through the years, Frankl would sometimes ask his patients who were so depressed, well, why don't you just commit suicide? The existential vacuum that is the mass neurosis of our present time, he says, is attributed to nihilism. Nihilism, or in some cases, people screaming out in the hall. But nihilism or nihilism, which is a sense that life is purely random and purely meaningless. Now, keep in mind that nobody, including nihilists themselves, actually live their lives on the basis that their lives are absolutely, totally meaningless and pointless. Everybody, in order to get through a single day, usually acts as if their actions are meaningful and that their actions are consequential. If nihilists really believed their own propaganda, then of course they would commit suicide, but they don't, or at least generally, usually they do not. There's two kinds of people, Frankl reminds us, the decent and the indecent. The decent are those who live for something or someone beyond their own selfish gratification. Now, at this point, he addresses, to the best of his ability, apparently, the role of religious faith. And he intertwines this with the blessings of art and beauty that we experience in this life. In many cases, those who persevered in the middle of all the evil that was experienced in the concentration camp, all that suffering, in many cases, they had a strong religious faith and had learned to be grateful for the most modest blessings in life, even in the midst of this horror. Frankl writes, quote, "We were grateful for the smallest of mercies. We were glad when there was time to delouse before going to bed." What a blessing to be able to delouse before you go to bed. In a subsequent book, Man's Search for Ultimate Meaning, and if we'd had more time in this course, I would have liked to have spent 45 minutes or so on that book. It's also very, very valuable, Man's Search for Ultimate Meaning. But in that book, Frankl notes that for most of those who survived the Holocaust, the number of those whose religious life was deepened in spite of, not because of this experience, by far exceeds the number of those who gave up their beliefs. We wouldn't expect that. Surrounded by so much evil, so much ugliness, all of this tended to intensify some prisoners' perceptions and appreciation for the simple beauty in nature, for instance. By the way, naturalists, atheists, and so on, they have no explanation for why we even have this sense of beauty. I mean, it's just stuff, right? It's just materiality. Why do we think that some stuff that we see in life, in nature, is beautiful? It makes no sense unless we're created in the image of God with those kinds of sensitivities and sensibilities. Now, Frankl puts it this way: as the inner life of the prisoner tended to become more intense, he also experienced the beauty of art and nature as he never had before. One evening, when we were already resting on the floor of our hut, dead tired, soup bowls in hand, a fellow prisoner rushed in and asked us to run out to the assembly grounds and see the wonderful sunset. Standing outside, we saw sinister clouds glowing in the west, and the whole sky was alive with clouds of ever-changing shapes and colors, from steel blue to blood red. The desolate gray mud huts they were surrounded with provided a sharp contrast. Then, after minutes of moving silence, one prisoner said to another, "How beautiful the world could be." Again, where do we get this idea that something is beautiful or something is ugly if all we are is material beings? And again, flukes of the universe, flukes of an impersonal universe. Another time we were at work in a trench. The dawn was grim and gray all around us. Everything was gray, including the faces of my fellow prisoners. I was conversing silently with my wife, as he oftentimes did. Or perhaps I was struggling to find the reason for my suffering, my slow dying. In a last violent protest against the hopelessness of imminent death, I sensed my spirit piercing through the enveloping gloom. I felt it transcend that hopeless, meaningless world, and from somewhere I heard a victorious yes in answer to my question of the existence of an ultimate purpose. Now, at that very moment, a light was lit in a distant farmhouse, which stood on the horizon as if painted there in the midst of all this miserable gray that I was surrounded with. A light comes on far away in a farmhouse. And this verse came to mind: "And the light shineth in the darkness." I communed with my beloved, his wife. More and more, I felt that she was present, that she was with me. Then at that very moment, a bird flew down silently and perched just in front of me on the heap of soil which I had dug up from the ditch, and it looked steadily at me. Now, in the process, Frankl says that he developed a greater sense of cosmic consciousness. He says, I had learned to let fate take its course. If we believe that the present world is not the terminal point of our existence, if we actually believe there's something beyond this, if there is in fact another dimension of life, then the question of ultimate meaning and human suffering can certainly be answered. If there's any meaning and purpose in life at all, then there must be meaning and purpose also in suffering and dying. He writes, quote, what was really needed was a fundamental change in our attitude toward life. It did not really matter what we expected from life, but rather what life expected from us. We had to think of ourselves as those who were being questioned by life, daily and hourly. Our answer must consist not in talk, but in right action and right conduct. Suffering is an opportunity, he says, to add a deeper meaning to life and to bear it with dignity, courage, and selflessness. Ooh, suffering is an opportunity to add a deeper meaning to life and to bear it with dignity, courage, and selflessness. Suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment that it finds a meaning, such as the meaning of sacrifice. This all has meaning and purpose. When suffering unjustly for a righteous cause, such suffering can even become ennobling rather than degrading. I mean, what kind of people think like
That's
this?
exactly what
Right?
I'm thinking. Particularly there. in that condition.
Yes, right. To quote Nietzsche again, that which does not kill me only makes me stronger. Well, if we cooperate and take it in the right spirit, it does. And in that regard, the last of human freedoms is the ability to choose one's attitude in a given situation. Nobody can force you to react negatively, regardless of your situation. You have freedom of choice as to how you respond and react. And that's to curse God or to understand that this is all for a purpose. It all has meaning. And again, to quote Nietzsche, he who has a why to live can bear with almost any how. In the concentration camp, stripped of all ego and false dignity, Frankl came to know his true self without illusions. He's not a great scholar and intellectual or, a pioneer in the field of psychology. When he's in the concentration camp, he's nothing. He's nothing to these people.
Jeffrey,
Yes.
in the book, The Search for Ultimate Meaning,
Yes.
his comment about those who survived typically had religious beliefs
Mhm.
deepened. Does that book say anything about his personal experience? Because he never really talks about God or anything much in this.
He does talk about God to a limited extent, yes. And again, he does believe that the only explanation for this sense that we have that our lives are important is if that's been imbued by God. But as far as the character and nature of God, he won't go there, even though, again, he could merely access Jewish tradition in terms of understanding to a great extent the character and nature of God. But
It's almost as if he expressed it without realizing it.
well, and I think he wants to address as broad an audience as possible. And he's certainly no theologian, to say the least. So I think that might explain why he comes up to the point of belief in God, but he doesn't really go on from there and talk in any kind of specificity. All right, so three.
I had a quick question. Could you
Yes.
go back to that point that you were making right before the last comment, that suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning?
Mhm. Yes.
Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Mhm. Yeah, and that is, we don't live in an impersonal, meaningless universe. Our life has meaning and purpose. God is watching over us, not in the way that we would prefer oftentimes. So Jackson Brown song that begins, God is great, God is good. He guards our neighborhood. Not exactly the way you would. And so we always think that, God loves us. We understand that. And if he loves us, we assume that he's going to make the path smooth for us in life. But what if the ultimate purpose is the formation and maturity of our faith and our character? Then, as we talked about in our previous course on theodicy, the problem of reconciling the reality of God and God's nature with all the suffering in human life, it becomes more understandable and more bearable. Does that help, Janet?
Yeah, if the ultimate purpose is to do what to our character? I'm taking notes.
Well, if the ultimate purpose is to further refine and develop our character and our faith, then a lot of what we encounter, including the unpleasant things in life, we can see, in fact, do have meaning and purpose. Think of some of the tragic things or very difficult things in one's own life, and did that drive you closer to God? Many people it does. For others, they get angry and hostile toward God and turn away from him. But for many, they realize how absolutely vulnerable they are and how desperately we need his guiding presence. Well, let's look at the section. Thank you. Let's look here at the section 3, sources of meaning. And Frankl tells us that meaning in life is the result of pursuing things that matter. And this again is where he says, don't aim for success or you're going to miss it, because the standard for success just keeps eluding us, basically, keeps retreating as we move forward, you might say. For success, like happiness, cannot be pursued, it must ensue. And then also in that section, Frankl will talk about how finding one's meaning in life is an unintended side effect of one or more drives. One is personal dedication to a cause greater than oneself. Now, again, as we talked about earlier, see, by calling readers to a cause greater than oneself, Frankl is implying here that the cause itself should be true and good and beautiful and honorable and righteous. In other words, those are characteristics of God, aren't they? So personal dedication to a cause greater than oneself. Number 2, love for and service to someone else other than yourself. Transcend your own egocentrism. And of course, that's very compatible with Christian faith, right? Where Jesus tells us, love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind. And then the second greatest commandment is likened to it, and that is love others as you love yourself. Okay. Thirdly, so we have personal dedication to a cause greater than ourselves. We have love for and service to others other than ourself. And then thirdly is patient endurance or patient suffering in the midst of an existential challenge or an existential crisis. And of course, Viktor Frankl knows all about that. Okay. As one sacrifices his life for a greater cause or for another person, he gains greater peace and joy and meaning in life. I think we all understand that. Happiness, like success, is a byproduct of a greater commitment beyond oneself. We essentially let happiness and success happen by not pursuing happiness and success. Now we're about out of time. What sustained Viktor Frankl were a couple of things. Number one, warm thoughts about his wife. He tells us that she's always on his mind. He's always communing with her in his thought life. Okay. And secondly, a great purpose. Thoughts of lecturing someday on the psychology and the life lessons of the concentration camp. So he's thinking about this, you know, if I made it through this horrible, brutal ordeal, I have so much I could share with people that would be so inspiring and help them make it through life. So he has this vision that his life does matter. And that's what propels him from, you know, day to day to keep going on. Says, for hours and hours, I would compose speeches in my mind. Eventually, I began to reconstruct the manuscript, which I had lost when he was being processed into Auschwitz. And I scribbled the keywords in shorthand on tiny scraps of paper. He had entered the concentration camp with apparently several pages of notes that he'd compiled in previous weeks or months. He wanted to write a great work on logotherapy. Well, obviously, as soon as he gets to the concentration camp, they're all stripped naked, and anything that they're carrying in or is disposed of and all. But as he's meditating on these thoughts, some of these ideas come back to him, and he's able to, I don't remember the details, he's able to come across a few scraps of paper, and somebody gave him a little stub of a pencil, apparently, and he starts writing down some of these ideas that he had when he came into the concentration camp. Eventually, he writes, I forced my thoughts to turn away from the oppressive trivialities of life in the concentration camp. Oppressive trivialities of life in the concentration camp. I forced myself to turn to another subject. Suddenly, I saw myself standing on the platform of a well-lit, warm, and pleasant lecture hall. In front of me sat an attentive audience of comfortable upholstered seats. I was giving them a lecture on the psychology of the concentration camp. By this method, I succeeded somehow in rising above the situation, above the suffering of the moment, and I observed them as if they were already in the past. Both I and my troubles became the object of a very interesting psychoscientific study undertaken by myself. What am I going to tell people if, in fact, God gets me through this? Boy, I could write a great book. I could inspire so many people, that will take them beyond their misery and despair and depression in which they currently are existing. He goes on to say, we will never know until the end of our life what the ultimate meaning of it all was. To invoke an analogy, he says, think about a movie. It consists of thousands upon thousands of individual pictures, and each of them makes sense and carries a meaning, yet the meaning of the whole film cannot be seen before its last sequence is shown. On the other hand, we cannot understand the whole film without having first understood each of its components. You can't just see the last minute, Isn't it the same thing? Isn't it the same for life? Doesn't the final meaning of life also reveal itself if only at its end on the verge of death? And doesn't the final meaning depend on whether or not the potential meaning of each single situation was actualized to the best of our knowledge and belief? Everything that happens to us in life goes into the film of our life. And as we're going through it, it can be very, very confusing, even overwhelming, maybe depressing and so on. But rest assured, God does have a meaning and a purpose for us, as difficult as our circumstances may very well be. So he talks about determinism, strict determinism, and free will. Some interesting comments there. Some comments on drugs and addiction. He talks about, and I'll close with this, in the section there in your notes, assessments. This book is an absolute antidote to pop psychology. Now, we're flooded these days with a lot of pop theology as well in some churches. But pop psychology, of course, just rules in secular society. Frankel's psychology is absolutely contrary, absolutely antithetical to all this fashionable pop psychology, and it's refreshingly devoid of egoistic self-absorption, which dominates the field of pop psychology. In contrast to those who would deny pain and displeasure, he believes everything and every experience in this life is redeemable. The purpose of life, he says, is develop inner strength and develop the depth of character based on commitment to a worthy cause. For us, that's becoming more Christ-like. Development of a love relationship that transcends our own egoism. Well, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love others as you love yourself. And thirdly, patient endurance in the midst of life's trials. Jesus says in John 16:33, in this world, you will have trouble. John 5:19, in this world and in this life, you will suffer many trials. Now, we know that we are the children of God and that the whole world is under the control of the evil one. Gee, just listen to the news every day. Romans 8:28, though, in all things God works for the good for those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. And so in summary, the summa of it all, Frankel's epiphany, a few days after his liberation from the concentration camp, Frankel took a walk through the countryside. By the way, if you've ever been to Auschwitz, there's not a more beautiful place on earth that I'm aware of than the countryside around Auschwitz. What a stark contrast. And then you go into that concentration camp and see the contrast. But anyway, a few days after the liberation of the concentration camp, he takes a walk through the countryside. Birds are flitting about, singing their joyous songs. He writes, there was no one to be seen for miles around. There was nothing but the earth and sky and the larks, jubilation, and the freedom of space. I stopped, looked around, and I looked up to the sky, and then I went down on my knees. At that moment, I had but one sentence in mind. It was always the same. And this comes from Psalm 16, or perhaps from Lamentations chapter 3. At that moment, I had but one sentence in mind, always the same, quote, I called to the Lord from my narrow prison, and he answered me in the freedom of space. And he ends the book, how long I knelt there and repeated this sentence, memory can no longer recall. He was basically driven to his knees. But I know that on that day, in that hour, my new life started. Step by step, I progressed until I again became a human being.
The last
Wow.
paragraph in Brothers Karamazov, Alyosha has just left his dear Abby's dead, and he falls on the ground, kisses the ground.
Okay, and this is in the Brothers Karamazov.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hmm.
Say that again. I didn't hear.
Oh, the last paragraph, Brothers Karamazov, Belyasha, who's a beginning priest, has left his dear Abbey, who was a really sacred man. But the body has not had started to putrefy, which is no one can understand. And he's running and he's just running away from there. And all of a sudden he just falls on the ground and kisses the ground. It's just, it's like he's,
Thank you.
he really sees it.
So I think a lot of us, if we were sharing our testimonies and all, we could relate something somewhat similar to what Frankel writes about here and what you read in the Brothers Karamazov. And oftentimes it's something that was a redemptive act of grace in the midst of a great existential crisis in life, where we understood that we had absolutely nowhere else to turn, nowhere to go, except just to fall on our knees in God's presence. And in his own way, this seems to be what Viktor Frankl experienced.
You said about suffering. That's what you learn in suffering, is that you can't do it all yourself. I mean,
Absolutely.
you think you can and you can't. You just have to bear it
That's right.
with God's help.
If you have not had a chance to read Man's Search for Meaning, I implore you to do so. I do believe it's one of the most important books of the last 50 years. So much wisdom in there. Of course, we read it through the lens of the gospel. And in that sense, I would say it has far more meaning than otherwise would be the case. But thank God for Viktor Frankl, for God protecting him through this ordeal,
Yes.
for him having this vision of how God could use his life and all the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people whose lives he's touched. And thank you all. I've really enjoyed this course, and it's different, as most of you know, it's different from most of the courses that we offer through the Areopagus, but I think it's every bit as important, perhaps even more so than anything else we have in our seminar catalog. So thank those of you who joined us very faithfully online every week. And those of you in class, want to thank again Dave Tilley for his excellent presentation last week that got us into this book. So I hope it's really inspired each and every one of us to be more proactive, more diligent in making communion with God in the sanctuary of our hearts an absolute top priority in our lives. And so blessings on you all. I hope you can join us tomorrow evening as we discuss Kyle Bashir's book, Apatheism, How to Share the Gospel Effectively with Those Who Apparently Have Little or No Interest in it.
Is that going to be recorded?
It will be recorded, yes. Yes. Well, so thank you. Blessings to you all.
Thank you.
And very soon.
Blessings to you.
Thank
God
you.
bless you.